Welcome back to Refit and Sail. My name's George of the Solent Boat Butler. This is a Contessa 32 from 1978. That is a brand spanking new 2023 Beta 25 that arrived yesterday and has been lifted into the boat for me. And for the rest of this episode, I'm going to be plumbing it in, wiring it up, and hopefully by the end we'll be pressing the button and it will start off straight away. So come along for the ride and I'll show you how it's done. When you get your new Beta engine delivered, it looks a little bit like this, which is not terribly exciting, but because I believe the internet quite likes an unboxing video, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Here is the engine in place without me putting my head in the way. So you can see it's on its 4 engine mounts. What I like to do is to get the engine into its engine bay and leave it for 24 or potentially 48 hours before doing anything too much with alignment, because these rubber mounts can drop ever so slightly. So if the engine's sitting on them for 24 or 48 hours, then that's not a bad thing, because they kind of settle down maybe a little bit. At least I feel that's what they do. I've got it very, very roughly aligned at the back. I spent a bit of time doing that yesterday. Can't really see it around there. I'll take the camera around the side in a minute. So it's roughly where it needs to be, but I've got some fine tuning to do to get it absolutely dead aligned. So these mounts here, these are the standard mounts that you get with a Beta engine. They've got slots in so you can move the mounts side to side. Obviously you can adjust the height here as well. So I've got the nuts on the front mounts, top and bottom, done up. The ones at the back, I'm just resting it on the bottom nuts. I haven't wound down the top one yet. That's just because I'm still kind of playing around with it, and the more nuts that are done up, the more undoing you have to do every time you need to make an adjustment. But at the same time, you need some of them done up like that, because if you don't squeeze this plate between the two nuts, the shaft here, the threaded part tends to lean off to one side or lean back or whatever. So that just keeps everything roughly in alignment where it should be. Here is the back of the engine now. You can see I've got the shaft clamp, which has a flange which goes onto the back of the gearbox. Ultimately, there's going to be an R&D semi-flexi coupling that goes between the gearbox and that shaft clamp. But for alignment purposes, I like to get everything absolutely as close as I can get it, just using metal on metal, and then I'll introduce the R&D afterwards once I know that everything is correctly aligned. Now, I'm not going to record the alignment process because, frankly, it's really difficult to get cameras in here and attach them to places which aren't in the way, and me climbing in and out of the quarter berth and the cockpit locker to fiddle with nuts and bolts on the engine beds is difficult enough job without having to deal with cameras. It should be all pretty straightforward because I've got it fairly close. It just needs a little bit of tweaking now and fiddling just to get it absolutely spot on. This is going to be a fairly standard installation for a beta engine, I think. There's nothing particularly out of the normal for it. So obviously it's going to have diesel feed to a primary filter. I'm going to have to fit a primary filter back there somewhere. And then onto the engine, and then the return, which is up the top here, needs to go back to the engine. Electrical cables, that's fairly straightforward. The only thing that's happening on the electrical side that is non-standard, if you like, is we're going to be fitting an alternator to battery charger, which is a way of massively improving the efficiency of the alternator. So this has got the uprated alternator on it. So I think it's 80 amps rather than the standard 40 amps, something like that. So to make the most of that, we've got an alternator to battery charger to go on there. We are going to be then fitting on there the accelerator cable. We've got the gearbox gear selector at the back on the gearbox. What else we got? That's pretty much it. Diesel in, power out. Oh, water would be quite useful, wouldn't it? So that's the raw water pump. I've got to replace the seacock because the seacock that's under my bottom, under the step here, is a little bit on the small side. So I'm going to be putting a new seacock in the hull. That's going to come up to a water strainer, which I will attach to the side over here, which I have already purchased. We have a Vetus water strainer to fit. Hashtag not sponsored. It's just I tend to use the Vetus ones. So here we go. Nice big water strainer that will go in there. Shouldn't cause an issue with getting to anything, so that's good. And of course, the water needs to go out somehow, and the exhaust gases. So I need to fit a water trap at the back, ideally as close to the centre line as possible. There is potentially a bit of an issue with the high-rise exhaust at the moment. I may possibly have to get it adjusted slightly. It's very, very close to the underside of the cockpit sole, so I might get that removed and get that chopped down, re-welded, just to remove maybe 20 mil or so of rise on it. So it's got a 5-inch rise on at the moment. If it was a 4 or 4.5-inch rise, it'd probably be okay, but it's just a little bit close to the cockpit floor at the moment. I'm slightly worried about heat transfer. So that may get done once the alignment is done. Then a water trap obviously in the back there, and then exhaust can go back out the boat. I will probably also need to replace the exhaust fitting, the whole skin fitting for the exhaust as well. But I'll worry about that when I get to it. So what I like to do generally when I fit engines is, because every boat is slightly different, even when you get onto a Contessa, all the Contessas are ever so slightly different. I like to get the engine in, and then I can sit down and work out where all the other ancillary bits are going to go, like the water strainer and what have you. And then I can work out how much hose I need for all the different elements, whether it's diesel, water hose, exhaust hose, what have you. Make a shopping list, go and buy it all in one hit and get it all delivered, and then basically throw it all into the boat and plumb it all in. So that is the plan. But first I've got to get uncomfortable on my stomach and climb into the quarter berth and get on with that engine alignment and see if I can get it absolutely perfect, because in my view, it's kind of the worst job for me. It's fiddly, it's time consuming. You've got to try and move the engine around, sometimes really infinitesimally small amounts, just to try and get it absolutely perfectly aligned. So it can be a right fiddle. Sometimes you'll just get it like that and it will just get done. Other times you can be at it for ages, and for whatever reason it's just a bit of a sod. So I'm going to crack on with that. I'll see you later. Sometimes when you're aligning things you need to just make quite small adjustments, but it's also quite easy to get confused about how big or small that adjustment is. And one way to help combat that is to get your marker pen and just put a little mark on one face of a nut, and then you can say, right, I want to turn the engine down one full revolution of that nut, and you can keep going until that black appears. And I'll do the same on the other side, because at the moment the front is slightly too high. Do it all up again, and then I can see where it looks on the back of the engine in terms of alignment, and then I can decide if I need to go one more full turn or half a turn or up a quarter of a turn or whatever, but it gives you a reference point to work from. Now, it might not look any different to you on the screen, but I have just finished that alignment, so I can't even get kind of a 2 or 4 thou feeler gauge in between the two mating faces there, so I'm pretty happy that that is as good as it's going to get. And remember, the boat is probably going to flex ever so slightly when it goes back in the water, so if I've got it really close now, if I check it when it goes in the water, it should probably still be good enough that it won't need any further adjustment. So I might stick the R&D flexi coupling in there, because I need to see if the old prop shaft is going to be long enough, because we've mounted this engine slightly further forward in the engine bay than the old engine, so there's a chance that that prop shaft is just going to be a smidge too small. It just depends on how much shaft is in the coupling here. At the moment it comes to about there, well, I'm going to see. The other thing I'm going to do is remove this exhaust elbow, because at the moment it's pushing the exhaust gases not only down, which is fine, but it's also actually pushing it off to port slightly, and the only place I can fit the water trap is kind of down here on the starboard side, and it's going to make a real kink in the hose. If I put it in like that, it's going to be very difficult to fit, so the easiest option is to unbolt this, slice it, remove a little bit of height so that I've got a bit more height at the top here, and then I can twist that through maybe 45 degrees, weld it back on, and then it can be refitted, so problem solved. That's the exhaust elbow just tacked into position and then put back on the engine, just to see if its location looks better, and certainly the height is perfect. Quite happy with that gap. It's about 30 mil now, I guess, between that and the roof of the engine bay, and it's just canted over nicely, and it's going to miss, I think, where the cables go onto the gearbox, which is good, and it's pointing roughly where I want it to go, which is kind of down there, where the engine water lock is going to be for the exhaust. So so yeah, I think I'm going to take that back and get it welded. That's the exhaust elbow back in place. I've just done up the bolts to the German standard, which is good and tight. So that is going to be forcing the exhaust gases and the water that's coming out the exhaust into the rough location of where I'm going to be installing, about there, the water lock, and then the exhaust will then go out through the bulkhead on that side there. So we're all good. It's now Monday morning, and I have a big box of bits, hoses, connectors, joiners, control cables and all sorts that got delivered on Friday, so I can now crack on with getting this thing plumbed in and all connected up. What I find on the installation of these engines in these particular boats, because the engine bay is really quite compact, is sometimes you end up having to use pre-made silicon bends like this and like this to get connections onto the engine in the limited space, and you can cut these down to the right sort of size. And this is going to get used on the exhaust, the high-rise exhaust at the back there, and this one I've already pre-cut down is going to get used on the back of the heat exchanger. So the first job I'm going to do is stick this on the back of the heat exchanger. It's injecting water aft. This is going to bring it back so it's coming forward. I'm going to install a anti-siphon device like this. It's a Vitus one. This is going to go high up in the locker, so it's going to be slightly higher than the original one that was mounted on these screws just here in the engine bay, because it's good to get these as high as you possibly can, ideally as close to the centre line as well. So it's a bit of a toss-up on whether it's better to have it slightly lower on the centre line or slightly higher and in the locker on the back of this bulkhead, which is kind of just out of shot over there. I've decided to go for the slightly higher option. It's also going to make running the hoses slightly easier without getting kinks in those hoses. Once I've done that, I think I'm going to get on with fitting control cables. So I have got some Vitus low friction control cables. These are slightly better than the ones that were on the boat previously. The only downside is they are not colour matched to the boat. The old ones were red and these are blue. But what I've been able to do is get slightly shorter ones than the originals, because the originals had quite a lot of cable that was kind of snaking around the back of the boat, which is unnecessary weight and just unnecessary. So I've had a measure and I've got exactly the right length cables. So I'm going to be popping these on once I've done some hoses. So the ideal solution when you're fitting these engines, I find, is to try and work out what order you want to do things in, because there's no point in fitting things at the front of the engine bay like the water strainer or the diesel filter when you then need to do work behind those items that you've just fitted. So I try and work from kind of the middle forward and try and make access as easy as possible when you're doing the install. Right, stop talking and go do some work. A good tip if you are using these silicone hoses, when you need to trim them down, put your hose clip on the hose itself, and then that gives you something nice to cut against, because it's really easy to slip. These cut really easily when you have a very sharp knife, although they're very tough hoses in terms of strength. If you put your hose clip on there, you can then get your knife in and run your knife effectively around the inside of that clip, and you know you're not going to accidentally overcut on your hose. And as I say, doing this in mid-air is not very easy, but you end up with something fairly nice and neat like that. Although I'm going to just trim that ever so slightly because I was doing it in mid-air. So if you're cutting them yourself, don't do it whilst talking to video in mid-air. There we go, that'll do nicely. As part of the engine install, the boat is also getting a brand new filter. So with these things, they don't come with hose tails or fixings of any sort. They just come with two blanking blanking nuts or whatever they call them. So you have to fit those with some sealant on the threads and then get the appropriate hose tails, and again with some thread sealant I use this stuff, Hylamart blue. I've got that upside down, haven't I? There we go. So I use that stuff, put it on the threads, wind it in, it sets, it's fuel proof, and that does the job nicely. But of course I then need to mount this in the engine bay, and to do that it has a couple of about 8mm holes in the front there which are slotted so you can move them around a little bit. But of course I've got sound insulation in there which is all flexy and soft, so if I mounted this directly onto the sound insulation it's going to be all wobbly, and whenever you come and move the exchange the filter, it's going to be really difficult because you've got to deal with this sort of wobbly mounted thing. So what I tend to do is I get a nice little block of wood like this, and you can see it's got 2 countersunk holes on that side. They are going to take a couple of M8 fixings all the way through. I have drilled these ever so slightly undersized, so I do actually have to screw them in. I've drilled them with a 7.5, and I'm going to put a little drop of quick setting epoxy on there, and I'll screw it all the way in, and that will leave me with 2 threads sticking out here. And then with these 4 holes I'm going to mount this block of wood on the side. So I'm going to cut a little square out of the sound insulation. I'm going to push this through the sound insulation because it's about the same thickness, cover it all in silver foil tape so you won't see it apart from these 2 fixings coming out. As I said, it's going to be held by 2 screws, and hopefully a helicopter is just going over, and then I can mount my filter to that, and you won't see this block of wood there because it will be hidden and disguised behind silver foil. So that gives me a nice firm mounting for the fuel filter. And there is my little mounting block in place. I unfortunately just ran out of silver foil tape, but I've got some more in the workshop, and if I get my little filter, pop that on, just needs a couple of nuts, a couple of washers, and jobs are good 'un. I'm afraid I haven't done much recording. I've just been getting on with plumbing in this engine here. You can see the fuel filter is in its final place, and what I like to do, I thought I'd show you this, is I like to put an inline tap in the feed to the fuel filter, and the reason for that is the other tap that you would need to switch off if you were changing the filter at sea is in the bottom of the cockpit locker, which is kind of back there somewhere, and you may end up having a load of stuff in the lockers, fenders and what have you. So actually if you want to change the filter quickly at sea, the ability just to switch that off, swap the filter out, switch that back on again, and then bleed it is a much easier, quicker option. I have also, as you can see back there, got the hoses in which connect into the exhaust. So that goes up to a anti-siphon device which is in the cockpit locker, and then comes back in, and then you can see possibly another silicone hose back there which is connecting it back into the outlet from the heat exchanger. Got some nice new control cables in there. So Vetus, again, not sponsored by Vetus, but they do make nice low friction control cables. That one is the throttle control, and the gearbox control cable is back there as well. You can see the blue cable there. Unfortunately the air filter is in the way, but you can see it goes down onto the gearbox, so that is all good. I've just done the fuel return, which is this one up here. It kind of loops up, goes down, and the important thing about the fuel return is it needs to drop down below the level of the bottom of the tank before it then gets connected up to the tank. So it would have been nice to tuck it all out of the way, but as it has to come down, there's a convenient hole there. So that's the fuel return done. So basically all the fuel is done, some of the water is done. I think the next job I'm going to do is probably put the water trap on there, and then I might start fighting with the exhaust hose. There is the raw water strainer now mounted really nice and securely. I did it in exactly the same way as I did the fuel filter. So there's a little block of wood in there. I've removed a small section of the sound insulation, inserted a little block of wood, and then I can through bolt that and so it doesn't move, because actually when you crank this up tight, sometimes you do need to put a bit of force on it to get those things to seal, and that will do nicely. I've also enlarged the old hole that went through the floor down here, so that's just big enough now for me to drop the hose through. Caught the paint slightly there, but the hose is going to be in front of that. But I may have to come back and do a little bit of painting, touching up at the back here, because the next job is working out where I'm going to fit this Vetus waterlock. So this thing's made in two sections. You can undo that clamp, and the top part swivels from the bottom part, which is great for making the hoses line up exactly where you want them. But I've got to mount that back there on a surface which isn't, excuse the camera work, I've got to mount it just there on the surface there, which isn't completely flat. So I've just been thinking about how I'm going to do that, and the solution I've come up with is I have a sheet of laid up glass fibre left over from another job. I'm going to cut a little rectangle of that out, which is the same size as the bottom of the waterlock. You can see it's got some fixings, holes there for fixing it down. So I will bog a piece of that glass fibre down there. I'll have to remove some of the paint to get a good bond, but if I do that, that will give me a flat surface to screw this thing down to, and that will be more than secure enough for its intended use, because it's never going to have a huge amount of water in it. It's going to have maybe at most probably 4.5 or 5 litres of water in it, so it's not going to have a huge amount of weight in it, and so that will hopefully work nicely. Here's the little cutout of glass fibre sheet I have made, and if you look in there, I've just marked on the hull where I need to remove some of that paint so I can bond this thing back down. Now, it doesn't actually need to sit flat because it's creating a flat surface, so the plan is to mix up some polyester filler with glass strands in it, and then I'm just going to cover the underside of that and stick it down, let that cure, and then I've got a nice flat surface that I can attach my waterlock to. There's my little piece of glass fibre sheet bonded into place, and if I take my waterlock, do this one-handed, that is going to, if I get it the right way around, because I've just oriented the inlets and outlets so that they fit correctly, that is going to sit quite nicely just about there, and that can get screwed down. That outlet is now pointing towards where the hose needs to go, through that hole, and over on the other side here the inlet is pretty much just below the outlet from the engine. So I'm going to let the bonding material I'm using underneath there, it's just a kind of a polyester with glass strands in it. Whilst that completely cures, I'm going to have a look at some exhaust hose and see if I can start running hose through to the back of the boat. And now you can see the water trap is all screwed down, fitted in place. It's got an exhaust hose connected up to the transom, and another bit of exhaust hose taking it up to that high-rise exhaust elbow. So that is all done. I've been happily working away on Concerto here, doing all the bits that I need to do to get this engine installed, completely forgetting that I'm supposed to be making a video about it as well. So I will try and give you a quick recap. Here is the new engine panel installed. As you can see, I have had to make a kind of backing piece. The panel for the old Yanmar 2GM was slightly wider than the new Beta one, but I had some of this carbon fibre sheet kicking around, so I have reused some of that just to kind of tie it all together with the same colour background. Now, it's not a complete match obviously, but we've got a slightly different colour black to there, and I think the black carbon actually kind of sets it off and looks quite nice in this particular situation. I've also put the little switch in right up there. You can see this little push switch here. That switch the engine bay lights on and off, and that's all kind of wired in. The next thing I'm going to be doing is I am working at the moment on the electrics. So I have put the negative supply onto the block. I've cleaned off some paint and I put the negative on there. The negative can go pretty much anywhere on the block as long as it's got a good clean connection. And that's gone back into where all the batteries are tucked in there. Managed to get the positive lead onto the starter motor, which is kind of tucked down there. It's really hard to record, so just have to take my word for it. I need to strap that cable up out of the way, away from the engine. I'm just working on the alternator side of things now. So as standard, there is a cable that goes from the alternator down to the starter motor that just links the two, so you don't have to put a separate cable in for the alternator. But we're doing something a little bit different with this engine. We're going to be fitting an alternator to battery charger, which basically makes this alternator work a bit like a smart charger for your batteries, and it includes a split charging system as part of that. So I have removed the standard cable that links the alternator to the starter motor, and I'll be fitting a new cable that goes from the alternator here to the alternator to battery charger, which I've just mounted up there. So I'm just in the process of drilling some holes to run the cables from the alternator to battery charger down to the batteries, and it's taken me a little while to work out exactly where I want to run those cables, just to make the route as short as possible, but also to keep it away from anything kind of moving or hot. So it needs to be something fairly sensible in terms of the routing. There's the cable there. I'm just going to start pulling that through now. I've just about finished on the electrical side of the engine install. So here you can see there's a second cable that kind of runs up and is cable clipped out of the way of the engine. So that cable is going into the back of the alternator, and it runs up around through the engine bay, up to the alternator to battery charger. And then I've got two cables just out of sight coming out of there, which run down through the engine bay and back to the new batteries that have also been installed. I need to just make up some new wooden wedges just to kind of chock the batteries into place so they can't move. I've also had to play around with some of the battery wiring, and I've added in this extra negative bus bar here just because there were absolutely loads of connections on the shunt, which is for the battery monitor. So a far better solution is to have them all onto that bus bar and then just have kind of one, or I've actually got two cables onto the shunt there. So that looks good. And the last piece of the puzzle was a brand new battery switch, and I've gone for one of these Blue Sea Systems battery switches, and this is a really simple system. It's a dual circuit battery switch, so when I switch it off, everything is off. When I switch it to on, everything is on. So what that means is there is a circuit for the engine which is on, and that is separate to the circuit for the domestics, which is also switched on at the same time. But what you can also do with this particular switch is, if your engine battery goes flat, you can go around one more and you can combine those two batteries like that. So it's kind of an emergency combining switch. So in normal operation, you'll come down to the boat to go sailing, and you'll go from off to on. Everything is on. You go sailing, and at the end of the weekend you can switch it off, but you have that emergency start feature there if you want. You can also achieve that with a kind of a separate combining switch, which I've done on other boats in the past, but this is a really quite neat solution. So we're going to go with this, and it also matches the colour of the engine and the batteries, which is quite pleasing. So we're going for a bit of a red and black theme with white bilges and white kind of tray around the engine. So we're very close to having this all ready. I'm just going to go through the checklist in the book to work out what, if anything, I have missed on the install, because we are very close to setting up a temporary water feed and pressing the start button. Now it's time to see if all that hard work pays off. I'm going to run the engine just for a very short period. I've got a bucket of water down there, and I've got a bottle of water to top it up with, so I can run it for a fairly short period and feed it with water just to make sure I don't overheat anything in the exhaust side. I'm not going to run it long enough for the engine to actually get hot, but the exhaust gets hot. So the exhaust hoses, which are designed to run wet, just need a bit of protection. Now there is a chance it will stutter and stall, because there's always a chance that there's a little bit of air in the fuel system. I have bled it as well as I can, as well as the engine will allow me to, but there's always a risk that there is some water on the high pressure side, sorry, some air on the high pressure side. But fortunately, the high pressure pumps on these, I believe, are kind of self-bleeding. So you can basically just keep kind of cranking it until it starts working all the air out, and it will just run. I've done that quite a few times without any issues. So I'm going to try and set the phone camera up, and we'll see what happens when I press the button. Right, battery's on. I'm just going to manually do the throttle, because that's going to be easier for me to control. Give it some heat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and well, as you just saw, that started and ran absolutely perfectly. So I'm really pleased with the engine, and the only thing I need to look at is it looks like the charging system wasn't charging. So I'm just going to go and quickly check that I haven't done something silly with the alternator to battery charger. There might be something in the setup I didn't press the button on, and then I'll give it another go. To solve that alternator charging issue, I have just run a little alternator feed wire from the alternator to battery charger. On the right hand side there's a little plug there for running a extra cable, and that connects into the back of the panel there, just to give it 12 volts when the engine is running, because some alternators require they need to see a voltage on their B plus terminal before they will start charging, and that's obviously the case on these motors. I remembered that I had to do exactly the same on another beta install I did on another Contessa with exactly the same setup, and that had slipped my mind. So I'm going to start the engine. In theory, there will be no more beeps on there. There'll just be a green light and everything will charge. So we'll give that a try now. It's always a slight worry testing things for the first time on camera, but genuinely, I've just plumbed that in, and I've no reason to think it won't work. It just needs to see 12 volts on the B+, and so we'll give it a go. I'm going to give it a bit of heat. And then press start. Yeah, we're all good. There's lights on the charger as well. Hard to see maybe on the video, but that is working as it should. I've had a few little jobs just to finish off on the install here of the engine and the associated system, so I needed to make up some wooden chocks to go around the new AGM batteries. So that's just to stop the batteries from moving around in the battery boxes when the boat's lurching, moving and being sailed. So we don't really want our batteries moving there. We want to be nice and secure. So that's all done. I've fitted the new True Design composite seacock under the step that I'm sitting on down here. So the old seacock was only I'm going to say 1/2 inch, and this engine needs a minimum of a 3/4 inch inlet for the water, so we put a 3/4 inch True Design seacock on there. The outside of the skin fitting for that seacock has been faired in because race boat, so that's all nice and smooth on the outside and looks pretty good. I have fitted a new Darglow Engineering Featherstream feathering prop on the boat. So this boat has had a feathering prop for the last 20-25 years. When I owned the boat, it had a Darglow JF prop, which is a very early feathering prop from Darglow, and it now has the very latest version of their prop. So that's called a Featherstream. I think it's Mark IV, possibly. Really, really nice piece of kit. I fitted loads of them, and frankly, if I didn't already have a feathering prop on my westerly, it would get a Darglow Featherstream. What else have I done? That's about it, really. I got to do some sea trials with the engine now, because we've got new prop, new engine, new gearbox. I want to check in the water that everything runs really nicely. So once it's in the water, I'll be taking it for a few trips up and down the river here, just to check everything works as it should, what sort of speeds we're getting out of the engine and prop combination, checking for leaks, obviously, checking there's no issues before I do the handover to the owner. Before that can happen, I've got to refit the rudder. I've got to do the anti-fouling and a few other little minor things on the outside of the boat just to keep it looking nice, and then we can chuck it in the water and say goodbye for another year. Before you go, I do have one more thing I want to show you, so just hold on there a second. Now, if you are a keen follower of the channel, you will know that a few episodes ago, I didn't just remove one engine from a Contessa, I removed two. And this is the other boat that has had a Beta 25 installed. And I said at the time that it'd be interesting to have two boats which are theoretically identical next to each other and replace both their engines. So they both had Yanmar 2 GM engines. They have both now got Beta 25 engines. Now, there are some slight differences in the install, but not very much, as it turns out. So this is just using the standard alternator charging system, whereas Concerto has an alternator to battery charger just to improve the performance of the charging from the alternator. But apart from that, it's all the same kit, all the same hoses, all the same equipment at the back, same stern gland even, because both have got brand new stern glands as well, which are water fed from the cooling seawater system. And that's about it. There was one interesting change though. Both boats have the standard kind of tray that was fitted in the 70s. Let me swap the camera around and I'll show you what that looks like. So down here, this is the standard GRP tray that was fitted to these boats in the 70s. And one interesting thing, or possibly interesting, is that all these Contessas are the same apart from where they're different. When I came to fit this engine in, I could not get the engine low enough to marry up and align with the prop shaft. So I ended up having to adjust the nuts on the feet to get it low enough. So if you look down there at the front, you can see those front engine mounts are as low as I can get them. And in fact, what I ended up having to do was to take those nuts out and take them off to the workshop. I stuck them in my lathe and just removed about 3 mil of material and put them back on. That then got me low enough at the front that I could wind it up and do the engine alignment. I could then measure the gap between the nut there and the nut below it, and that was about 35 thou, and I made up two little washers because what I couldn't get in there was a spring washer to stop the nut from unwinding. So I made a couple of shims. You can probably just about see the shim under there, and that ended up being the solution to get this engine just low enough to get the alignment all sorted. So I'll be doing the same as Concerto. I will be doing some test runs with her on the water because we have not only changed the engine, but we have refitted the Dargalo feather stream that this boat had, but the pitch has been changed to suit the engine and gearbox ratios. So this needs a run up and down the river as well before I do a handover with the owner. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could give me a like down below and hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. It really makes a massive difference to how I grow this channel, and the more people that like and subscribe, the more people will hopefully find my videos and do the same. So if you could do that, I really appreciate it. Also, a big thank you to those of you that donate to Refit and Sail. There is a Buy Me a Beer link down in the description, and you can click on that. It's a PayPal link and you can buy me a beer. I don't mind what it is that you donate. Anything that is donated is very, very much appreciated. Some of it gets spent on beer, and when I get enough money, I will invest the rest in better microphones, which are needed, and possibly lighting, and definitely a new camera as well at some point, so I can stop using my iPhone. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I will catch you next time. Bye for now.